The story begins in the past, during one of the bloodiest wars in history. It was a battle between the forces of justice and the demons. After countless deaths and endless fighting, the legendary heavenly demon was finally defeated by the fighting immortal. With his victory, the war finally came to an end. Years later, the fighting immortal's legendary martial art was passed down to an old dojo master. The old master loved telling his students that he had inherited the strongest fist technique in history. He even promised that if they trained hard enough, one day one of them could inherit it as well. Most of the children admired him. But there was one person who never believed those stories. The master's own son, the protagonist. From the very beginning, the protagonist thought his father was exaggerating everything. Every time he talked about the legendary fist, he even changed its name. Because of that, the protagonist believed his father was simply making things up. The old master only laughed and continued enjoying his peaceful life with his disciples. Although his son constantly argued with him, he was still proud of him. For the old master, living peacefully with his students and his son was already enough. Unfortunately, that peaceful life didn't last forever. One stormy night, a group of masked warriors secretly surrounded the dojo. They had come for only one reason: to steal the legendary martial art inherited by the old master. Even though he understood the danger, the old master had no intention of surrendering it. He stepped forward alone and prepared to protect his family and disciples, no matter the cost. A fierce battle immediately broke out. Despite suffering countless wounds, the old master refused to surrender. Finally, after being pierced by several swords, he gathered his remaining strength into one last punch and called the protagonist to his side. Looking at his son one last time, he smiled and prepared to leave behind his final lesson. The old master gathered the last of his strength into his fist. A bright energy surrounded his hand as he looked directly at the protagonist. With a weak smile, he asked, "Did you see that? This is my fist." The protagonist immediately rushed toward his father, begging him to stop talking and save his strength. But the old master knew he didn't have much time left. He admitted that maybe his son had been right all along. Maybe he wasn't truly invincible. Even so, he believed that his son would one day become far stronger than him. With his final breath, he gave the protagonist one last piece of advice. Find your own fist. The moment those words ended, the old master's body slowly turned into dust and disappeared before the protagonist's eyes. The protagonist stood frozen. He couldn't believe that his father was really gone. Along with his father's final moments, he inherited a mysterious martial arts manual. Inside the manual was the secret of the ultimate fist technique. It explained that every successor awakens a different version of the technique. That's why every master gives it a different name. The true power doesn't come from copying someone else's fist, it comes from creating your own. Meanwhile, the enemy leader stared at the battlefield in frustration. Instead of handing over the technique, the old master chose to die protecting it. Enraged, the leader gave a terrifying order: find every disciple of the dojo, and kill them all. Luckily, 4 senior disciples had managed to escape during the attack. Although they survived, all of them were seriously injured. They admitted that without the second senior brother's movement technique, none of them would have escaped alive. At the same time, the protagonist could do nothing except watch everything collapse around him. The loss of his father became the turning point of his life. From that day onward, he devoted himself completely to training. He isolated himself deep inside the mountains. Day after day, month after month, year after year, the protagonist trained without stopping. Every punch he threw carried the pain of losing his father. Every drop of sweat pushed him one step closer to revenge. 10 long years passed. At only 20 years old, the protagonist finally mastered the mysterious fist technique in his own way. Looking at his fist, he realized something. This wasn't his father's fist anymore, it had become his own fist. Believing he was finally strong enough, the protagonist decided it was time to leave the mountains and hunt down the people who murdered his father. But the moment he returned, he realized the world had completely changed. The village he remembered had disappeared. In its place stood a huge modern city filled with tall buildings and unfamiliar technology. Confused, the protagonist wondered if he had simply lost his way. Soon, he noticed people wearing strange clothes and carrying weapons he had never seen before. Some of them were talking about hunter ranks, guilds, and job interviews. The protagonist couldn't understand a single thing they were saying. This wasn't the world he left behind. Wanting answers, he stopped an old man and asked what had happened to the village. The old man looked at him in disbelief. He asked if the protagonist had been living in the mountains for the last 10 years. Then he explained everything. 10 years earlier, while the protagonist was training, a massive black hole suddenly appeared in the sky. A mysterious energy poured out from it, transforming countless plants and animals into terrifying monsters. Soon after, beings from another world, known as hunters, began appearing. Unlike ordinary martial artists, they possessed incredible supernatural abilities. The war that followed was devastating. Even low-ranked hunters were powerful enough to defeat most martial artists with ease. In just a short time, nearly 80% of Mirim's warriors were wiped out. Just when humanity was about to lose everything, 4 legendary martial artists appeared. They were none other than the Old Masters' killer disciples. Together, they became known as the 4 Heavenly Kings. Leading both martial artists and awakened hunters, they fought back against the invaders and eventually brought the war to an end. Peace finally returned, but the world had changed forever. Modern cities replaced old villages. Guilds replaced martial arts sects. Hunters became the strongest people in society. After hearing the entire story, the protagonist finally understood why everything looked so unfamiliar. He realized that the world had moved on while he was isolated in the mountains. Still, he refused to forget his original goal. First, he needed to gather information about his father's killers. As he reached into his robe, he suddenly froze. His money was gone. Even worse, his father's precious martial arts manual had disappeared. Someone had stolen it. Using his sharp senses, the protagonist quickly traced the thief's energy to a nearby rooftop. There, he found a blue-haired girl holding his belongings. Instead of looking guilty, she immediately accused him of being a suspicious man. The protagonist calmly told her that she had stolen something more valuable than his own life. The girl was shocked that he had managed to track her down so easily. She slowly realized that this mysterious martial artist was far stronger than she had expected. Without wasting another second, she nervously returned the manual and apologized. However, this unexpected meeting was only the beginning of an even bigger problem. After getting his martial arts manual back, the protagonist was ready to leave. But before he could go, the blue-haired girl suddenly stopped him. With tears in her eyes, she asked if he could lend her some money. The protagonist was confused. He didn't even know what the current currency was, but he still had a few old iron coins left. The girl immediately said those coins would be enough. Then she began telling a heartbreaking story. According to her, both of her parents had died, and her younger sister was seriously ill. She claimed that a dangerous disease had spread through her village, and the only person who knew the cure demanded an enormous amount of money. Anyone who couldn't pay was forced to give up their body as payment instead. Because of that, she had no choice but to become a thief. At least, that's what she wanted the protagonist to believe. In reality, she was secretly congratulating herself. She was convinced that her emotional acting had fooled him completely. But the protagonist wasn't thinking about lending her money. Instead, he calmly said, "If your situation is really that serious, then I'll solve the problem myself." The girl was completely caught off guard. She had only wanted a few coins. Now the protagonist wanted to meet this so-called healer in person. With no other choice, she led him through the city. After a while, they arrived in front of a suspicious building. The moment the protagonist stepped closer, he frowned. There wasn't even the slightest smell of medicine. Instead, the entire place was filled with a sinister atmosphere. 2 large men stood at the entrance, looking more like criminals than doctors. The protagonist immediately realized something wasn't right. He turned around and prepared to leave. However, the men had already noticed him. Looking at his strong physique, they started discussing how much money they could make by selling him as a slave. They assumed he was just another homeless martial artist with nobody to protect him. Then came the biggest surprise. The blue-haired girl walked over to the criminals and casually asked how much they were willing to pay for the protagonist. She had been working with them from the very beginning. The entire sad story about her sick sister was nothing more than a trap. One of the thugs grabbed the protagonist by his clothes and mocked him. He told the protagonist to accept his fate as a slave. Instead of panicking, the protagonist smiled. After seeing people like these criminals, he felt strangely relieved. Even though the world had changed over the past 10 years, trash like them still existed. Without saying another word, the protagonist threw a single punch. In an instant, a blinding shockwave exploded through the room. Chapter 1 comes to an end. If you enjoyed this explanation, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for the next chapter, because the protagonist's real adventure is only just beginning.